Hi, and welcome to week 3. This week, we're going to be discussing Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, a book that was written in a time and place of great revolutionary change. And when you view and listen to the presentation that I've placed on the Blackboard site about the book, you will note that we are discussing it to get a greater understanding on the nature of oppression and how we as people of faith can come alongside of those folks who have had to struggle with that oppression. We're also reading this book because Freire's philosophy informs my own approach to the teaching of this class, particularly when he talks in Chapter 2 about banking versus problem-posing education. You may already have noticed that I don't so much tell you what to think, what I think you should know, say via a lecture, as I do raise questions to prompt you into a dialogue with one another and to explore the topic together and learn and teach one another. Well, this is classic Paulo Freire. Just a word on pronunciation of his name. You'll notice that I pronounce it Freire. That is the Portuguese pronunciation of the name. You'll notice in the PowerPoint presentation that I refer to him as Freire, and that was up until recently how I pronounced the name until I learned the proper way to do it. Although you will hear many people refer to his name as Freire or Freire. So whatever is most comfortable with you, I think is fine. Also, you want to recognize in the assignments for this week that by this Sunday at 11:59, you should submit your faith and vocation paper. And you'll submit it through the Blackboard site by clicking on the assignments button and then opening the written assignments folder. And within that folder is the faith and vocation folder. And inside of that, if you go to the very bottom, you'll notice a portal that says submit your assignment here. And just like you would attach a document to an email, you open that and you have a place to attach it, and then you first submit, and it will go right in the gradebook and where I can get it. So need to do that by Sunday, 11:59. And remember, there are no late papers, so if it's after that time, it will not be accepted. Now, in talking about oppression and the liberation of those who are oppressed, we're assuming a value of social justice. And so for our scripture reflection today, I want to talk for a moment about a passage that speaks to the issue of justice from Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17. Now, a little background on Isaiah. Isaiah is in the section of the Old Testament known as the prophets. And a lot of times people think of prophets as people who foretell the future. But in the Bible, prophets were not so much people who foretold the future as they were people who illuminated the underlying issues of current events in the present. And through that, they called people to account. And that's what we find in this passage. There are prophets in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Testament, who are official prophets. That is, they were actually on the payroll of the king or the leader at the time. And there were many unofficial prophets, people who just felt called by God and went out and spoke the word of the Lord without any official sanction. Well, Isaiah, as it turns out, was an official prophet. He was a prophet in the court of King Hezekiah and some of the other kings, and so he is, in a sense, a professional advisor to the king. Now, what about the book of Isaiah itself? It's 66 chapters, and as you read it, you realize that it's referring to events that span probably a couple hundred years. And for that reason, many scholars believe that Isaiah was written not simply by one author by the name of Isaiah, but rather by 2 or 3 different authors. And if you go into commentaries and other biblical literature that deals with the book of Isaiah, you'll often hear them referring to the first Isaiah, the second Isaiah, and the third Isaiah. It's pretty clear that this particular section was written by the original Isaiah, first Isaiah, who lived sometime in the area of the 8th century before the birth of Christ. And this was a time of relative calm and peace, and with that came a certain level of complacency. Now, the section that we are going to be looking at in chapter 1, verse 17, actually starts back in chapter 1, verse 10. And if you look at that, you'll notice that Isaiah starts this section by saying, "Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the law of our God, you people of Gomorrah." Isaiah is speaking, therefore, these words that we're going to read to the rulers, the leaders of the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, Sodom and Gomorrah are best known to most people for a story in Genesis chapter 18 where a group of citizens of those cities failed to properly welcome two strangers who had come into their midst. And in popular Christian thinking, Sodom and Gomorrah are often thought to be places of gross immorality, particularly homosexuality. In fact, the English word sodomy, which is a euphemism for homosexuality, actually comes from that popular Christian thinking about what was going on in Sodom. But really that is a misunderstanding, because as we will see here, that's not what these towns were being condemned for at all. It had nothing to do with homosexuality at all. The other thing that we need to note is, according to Genesis chapter 18, these two cities supposedly were destroyed by the judgment of God. So it is unclear if after that time the cities were rebuilt, and therefore it's unclear if Isaiah is referring to the actual communities of Sodom and Gomorrah, or he's using the names of those towns as metaphors for people or communities or leaders who have come under the judgment of God. It's unclear to us. And the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah we see in this section, again, has nothing to do with sexual immorality, but has to do with the fact that whoever Isaiah is talking to practiced a belief system and a form of worship that was devoid of any meaningful action. So, as we read this, Isaiah says, starting at the end of verse 16 and then going into verse 17, he says, "Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right." The wrong has been the fact that they've sort of had this empty belief system and this empty, meaningless kind of worship. And here's what he means when he says, "Learn to do right," going on in verse 17. "Seek justice." And then he spells out what seeking justice means. It means encourage the oppressed, defend the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. The wrong here in this passage is a failure for the people to have lived out their beliefs in concrete and visible ways. They go to worship, they do the sacrifices, they hang the incense, they say the right words, but their lives are devoid of any concrete and visible evidence that what they say they believe is actually true. And the right, the justice that Isaiah is calling them to do, is to work on behalf of people in that society who are marginalized and pushed down by the dominant order. The oppressed would be those who have been denied basic human rights. The orphan were children who had lost their parents, and in that society they had no standing, they had no right. There was no division of youth and family services. There was no foster care system. They were just left to roam the streets and advocate for the widow. Same thing with women in that society whose husbands had died. They had no right to inherit their husband's wealth. They had no standing in the community. They were completely on their own. And so Isaiah says, do justice. Back your belief system up with concrete action by encouraging the oppressed, defending the fatherless, and advocating for the widow. Now, the connection to Paulo Freire in all of this is that Freire believed that all knowledge, for it to really have taken root in our lives, needed to be accompanied by concerted action. He called this integration of knowledge and reflection and action praxis. Praxis is the integration of knowledge, reflection, and acting on that knowledge in a kind of ongoing cyclical way. And for people of faith, it means if our knowledge is disconnected from concerted action, particularly on behalf of the poor or the oppressed, then either we're being hypocritical, like Sodom and Gomorrah, or when we talk about our beliefs and our rituals and what's so important to us in our faith, we really have no idea what we're talking about, which is what Freddie would suggest. In the New Testament, the Apostle James wrote, "Faith without action is dead." And that is what both Isaiah and Paulo Freire are saying as well. And so as we discuss this classic text, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, my hope is that not only will our minds and hearts be stretched, but that something within us will get stirred up to continue to explore the ways to put our words and faith into specific, visible action. Have a great week, and I look forward to interacting with you in the discussion groups.